Our farm bot just told me when I asked, I had cost overruns and my yield was lower than expected, to figure out how to understand the situation better, but it doesn't know what input costs were over budget. It doesn't know that the yield shortfall was a certain percent. This is a real farm, and that data is in Google Sheets or Excel or whatever it is. And right now, the bot is giving advice as if it knows nothing about what's actually happened here. So, there is a difference between a general agriculture assistant and one that really knows the bones of this operation. This episode closes that gap. In one of the previous episodes, we added a weather tool. Claude decides when to call it. It gets the data from the weather function, which is controlled by us, and only when the question is involving current conditions. And that's like the correct pattern for live data, conditional, fired only when relevant. Farm data is a little different because every strategy question benefits from knowing what happened this season. How much did the input cost per plan? What was the actual yield? Where did the margin go? What did the reading show at the weighing station for the truck carrying all the cotton or all the groundnut? That context is always relevant. So there's no decision to take. We will inject it every single time. Let's figure out how we do that. Looking at the code, we first see that you're adding the sheet ID and the Google Apps API that you guys would have to get from the Google Cloud console. I'm sure there are lots of tutorials to explain this. And then we get our sheet ID for what we need to input to Claude. And remember, this is not a tool, so it will not be sent as a tool use paradigm. We give the entire sheet range. And there are various helper functions about looking up changes in values, looking up certain cells, and so on and so forth. But the main helper function here is the get farm data, right? The pattern is pretty simple. At the top of the strategy handler, we read the farm data once and then format it as a short context block, right? And then Claude will now start every strategy conversation knowing the actual numbers for this season. But the key question is, what do we inject? So the actual sheets are pretty vast. They have several subjects like land prep, agricultural inputs, agrochemicals, the irrigation, the labor, and the packaging and the production, which would be how it would be for every farm or every operation in any industry. There would be various fields that might overwhelm Claude. So we inject the most important ones, and we figured out that would be the 8 that you see here that allow us to understand the profitability and the production of this farm. So we inject only crop, area, planted date, planned versus actual cost, yield, price, and margin. That's enough to reason about the season. Not super duper accurate to the minute or anything, but not so much that it drowns everything else. Right. So now we get this from the get farm data function. There's no real OAuth, there's no service account. It's secured in Vercel via an API key, and it fetches a summary range, parses the raw value into a dictionary, and then returns it. So where does it go? It goes to the same API call for the farm strategy. But as we learned from the previous episodes, how do we handle errors for things like this? So there are two places. If Sheets is slow, then we don't hang the whole webhook. The function will return like none on any failure, and the strategy agent degrades gracefully. It will still answer, but without farm specific context. Same pattern as the weather tool. Failures are logged and handled, but they are not shown to the end user, obviously. And this is the context template, right? It is a context block that gets injected into the system prompt in plain text, not JSON. Why? Because the model reasons better with prose than it does with JSON, especially when you have words alongside something like 24% over on on the inputs and so on. JSON is more when we want to process that data later, not for the model to reason. We also add a few lines to the handle farm essentially has farm data equal to get farm data, which calls a function that we just saw. And the farm context is that string where we want all of this data to be converted into some kind of prose, right? So this is the second error catching point where it will format the farm context template from the farm data, and it will populate this string. And then when we are sending it back in the system, you can see here that alongside our farm strategy prompt, which checks the language, and then a context note which comes from the independent reviewer, we have now added this farm context. So that is giving Claude very good numerical and word mixed prose data for it to reason about how the farm is doing commercially into its farm strategy, and the rest of it pretty much remains the same. So one caveat here for caching is that Sheets is called on every strategy message, and we are fine with that because it's low volume, because farms don't just change overnight, they change per month or per season. So if you were scaling this with like hundreds of farms, then maybe you need something more persistent, but we don't currently. So it's a trade-off that you have to do, freshness versus cost of call, and for us the cost of call won't be that much. All right, so let's now test this after this whole push to production. This season I had cost overruns and my yield was lower than expected. What should I focus on next season? All right, so we have the farm's name. It says your costs ran 24.8% over plan, and it says I'd focus on understanding where the money went, and on the yield side it's coming a certain tonnage lower, and the price has held up well, so that's an advantage. The yield was a problem. It does get into its style of M dash and 2-word and 3-word sentences, and that's okay, but it does then tell you for the next season the two things most worth your attention are tightening cost controls before the next season starts, especially irrigation and labor budgeting. Can you tell me a little more about what happened in the field? Did the onions look healthy? So it can bring you back to the farm strategy or even the crop disease if you want, and we can question it about something that we saw and how it related to the cost. I don't know enough about the ground truth, but the farmer user would then say that, oh, this happened to my onions, it caused so and so loss, and it would bring the conversation back to one of our other agents. But we do get an excellent response. We also get a notice here that says it's based on the season's farm data, and if it did not, then it would actually say something like the farm data is missing in template. So there we have it. It's an excellent response based on how it's able to weave the Google Sheets data along with what the strategy is. And this brings us to a place where we are quite confident we can take this to the field and see what the user actually wants. I'm pretty confident I can take it to the field to the actual users because it will route messages, diagnose diseases, runs independent reviews, escalates when it should stop, fetches the weather, and now reads actual farm data. The code base has grown, and now the question is, how does any contributor or even an AI assistant understand it well enough to work on it safely? So in the next and final working session in this 15-part series, we will focus on the Claude.md and bring it back to how we actually use Claude to do this. How do you write a file that explains the code base to Claude, sets guardrails on what it should and shouldn't do, change on its own, and makes the whole project easier to build on before we wrap up this series with a summary. So thank you so much, and see you in the penultimate episode next time. Bye-bye.